So while going blue in statewide races, Colorado voters were not nearly as generous with ballot issues. Only restrictions on payday loans and new redistricting policies passed. Meanwhile, Denver voters approved all the proposed civic measures, including 4 sales tax increases and a controversial campaign finance initiative. David, we talked about ballot initiatives on election night and we talked about how many of the ballot issues were actually there to combat another ballot issue. 112 and 74 come that way. I think you talked about 109 and 110 that way. Are those battles just going to come back in 2 years?
Well, no, but the issues are going to be very important in the legislature in January, because there are still issues on education, on transportation, and on oil and gas. Polis was asked, well, does the pretty wide margin of defeat for all these things, does that affect what you're going to do in the legislature? And his answer was no, because I didn't endorse any of those things, and presumably he's not going to support something that's an exact copy of those, but he'll still be moving in the same direction. There's a state budget surplus now, so they're certainly going to throw a lot of money at the at education, and given Polis, I think, would be inclined to have that tied to some measurable performance improvements and reforms. I'm not sure the state house would be so inclined to actually care about performance rather than just more money. There will be another assault on oil and gas, probably not something to completely wipe it out in one fell swoop, but in moving in that direction, certainly, because it's for many people not so much a science issue as a moral issue. And then I think this legislature will continue what has been the policy of past ones, which is to totally neglect roads and say, if you people aren't going to raise your taxes to pay for roads, well, we're certainly not going to spend our precious $30 billion in record revenue on mundane things like roads when we can give the money to interest groups instead.
Eric, in the face of, I think it was about $37 million spent on ballot issues from the oil and gas companies, the Proposition 112, which essentially was a fracking ban, got I think about 42%. I could be off by a percentage point or two. You have a Democratic state leader, now the Speaker of the House, who actually endorsed 112. You have Jared Polis in the governor's mansion. Proponents of 112, they may have lost in the official scoreboard, but it seems like a pretty decent win for them. What do you think?
I think reasonable environmentalists who want reasonable regulation, yes, it was a huge win. Having Casey Becker as Speaker of the House, congrats to her. Having Jared Polis in the governor's office, having huge Democratic majorities. Just as an aside, the number that somebody gave me last night, which stunned me, is there are now more Democrats in the Colorado House than there are Republicans in both the House and Senate, which is stunning in terms of the magnitude of the takeover. So I think reasonable environmentalists still have plenty of avenues and plenty of places to turn. The sort of the fractivist activists out a little bit on the fringe, who I think were the driving force behind 112, no, they were rejected. Extreme measures were rejected. Dialogue about responsible measures can continue and continue among some pretty friendly faces. I think we showed once again that Colorado is a very accessible ballot. You can get measures on the ballot. Getting them across the finish line is much, much harder, and you ran the list. It's a very short list of those measures that did get across the finish line, and to my thinking, they were there before the campaign even started because they just had that visceral appeal. If you don't have that visceral appeal, if you have to make a detailed argument for the measure, the no side has such an advantage.
Joey, let's talk about that. It wasn't as if Colorado voters went no down the board. They read the ballot. 111 is right in the middle of that pack, and it passed well. So did Y and Z. I think maybe even X may have. That was the hemp one. So clearly, Colorado voters were not just in a full no mood, but they said no to an awful lot.
Yeah, well, you know, Cyndi Lauper said it. Money. Money changes everything. And if you, we don't quote Cyndi Lauper on this show enough.
We do not.
You look at who was behind these initiatives, and there was a lot of money behind 112 on both sides. The oil and people like to talk about all the money that oil and gas interests put in. Well, the people like the Sierra Club and Tom Steyer, they've been putting a lot of money into this state as well. And this is going to continue to be a battleground. I would urge legislators, especially Democratic legislators and especially very liberal legislators, to proceed with caution on energy. Because, if they want a geyser in their backyard, then Anadarko and Nobel will be glad to put a geyser of money in their next campaign. This time they were tied up with 112. The next time there won't be a 112 on the ballot. And I think we could see a change in the leadership and the majorities in the House and Senate if oil and gas decides to play in those races.
Patty, you don't have to quote Cyndi Lauper in your answer, but I think some were mystified that Democrats ran the table, essentially, with ballot issues that spoke to some of the issues that Democrats may have stood for, didn't do well. Is that where Colorado split its ticket, where it usually does Democrat-Republican, now they just went Republican on the issues?
I wouldn't say they went Republican on the issues either. I think in Colorado, people are a little hesitant to be told what to do. And I think that was it. They were kind of bossy, those initiatives. 110 was very, very bossy. You've got to go out and pay more money for the roads when people are wondering why with $30 billion there isn't money for the roads. I think with 112, it was just overreach on 112. And I think the oil and gas industry will come back to kind of rue the day. They'll look fondly at 112 because they could have taken it to a legislature that might have had more Republicans in it and backed it down a little. Now I think what will happen is, let's not forget, Polis was ready to have fracking measures on the ballot several years ago, made a compromise. Now he's got the opportunity to come up with what was his ideal and see if he can push it through. I don't see people fighting him very hard in the legislature. But going back to the ballot measures, in Denver, we are spending money like drunken sailors. It is amazing that all 4 of those went through, and the one that seemed the most Scrooge-like, that people weren't going to pay for the scholarships, even also passed. We've created a monster for the next campaign in May. Just even the people who want to run, who are going to have to deal with the new campaign finance rule in Denver. It is a crazy lineup of things that we passed.